Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. My name's Verghese. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel. Be sure to check out our work over at InsideNebraska.com. If you're listening on audio, be sure to like this podcast. Subscribe to us, give us 5 stars. We'd really appreciate that wherever you're listening to us. Like I mentioned, we've got a lot going on over at InsideNebraska.com. Daily recruiting updates, football updates, so much more over there. We're in the backstretch of the football season coming out of TJ Latif's first start. We've got plenty of recruiting information as we kind of enter this final stretch to signing day. And as Nebraska picks up some momentum in the 2027 cycle, picking up a commitment last week, trending to pick up a couple more here in the weeks to come. So be sure to stay tuned to InsideNebraska.com. On the topic of signing day, we are just over 3 weeks away from the 2026 prospects signing and making their decisions official. And, just kind of wanted to touch on what's left for Nebraska in this final stretch to signing day. Nebraska only has 11 commits, still has some needs to address. Of course, it's going to be a smaller class, but we're kind of right. We're clock's ticking, and they have some needs to address kind of imminently. So, just wanted to assess just kind of what's at the table, what could change here in these next few weeks, and of course, Nebraska being on the bye, how do they plan to use that bye and get on the road to potentially recruit? So. Getting into all of that, we're touching on the latest updates in the wide receiver room. Nebraska's looking for a third 2026 wide receiver. Last week, they had Amari Saab, three-star wide receiver out of Glassboro, New Jersey, on campus alongside his younger brother, 2027 five-star athlete, Xavier Saab, the number one athlete in the 2027 cycle. For Amari, he's tentatively planning a return trip for the Iowa game at the end of the month. That's going to give him a second opportunity to get around the coaching staff, an opportunity to really feel out Nebraska and potentially evaluate a fit within the program just about a week before he'd be expected to sign on December 3rd. That's going to be a big visit if that happens for Nebraska. They're battling Oregon and Alabama primarily in that one. Ultimately, just comes down to what Amari wants. I think Nebraska, there's a clear path to the field. But his older brothers at Alabama. Oregon's been more consistent in that recruitment in recent weeks, though Nebraska's obviously picked up the pace here the last couple weeks. So that's what I'm curious to see. Nebraska most recently offered Quade Hendricks, UConn commit, three-star out of Winslow Township out there in New Jersey as well. Having a really big senior year, electric playmaker, downfield, can go outside his frame and create some plays, is electric as a returner. Just does a lot. Really, really, really kind of dynamic slot receiver. And Nebraska needs some slot depth to kind of look at the body types they're seeking out here as they pursue this third receiver. It's clear they're looking for some slot depth, and Quade fits that. So the plan is for him to visit before it's all said and done, potentially this weekend, but likely closer to the end of the month for that Iowa game. But the plan is for him to visit, give Nebraska a shot. He did also pick up recent offers from Minnesota, West Virginia. Curious to see just how seriously he evaluates those options, if at all. But Nebraska is kind of the new Power Four offer that's really catching his attention, really trying to make a run at him before he makes a decision or final decision in December. That's another recruitment just to keep an eye on late. Of course, UConn having a good season, and he kind of has a clear path to playing time over there. So that's going to be the biggest battle for Nebraska, is obviously being this new contender and trying to pull him out of the Northeast when he's got a program really close to home that has made him feel like a priority for so long. Elsewhere on the offensively, I mean, if there's anything really left for Nebraska, it's potentially another offensive line commit if the right one pops up. They are working to hold on to the commitment of Leon Noel, three-star offensive line commit out of New Orleans. He was at Mississippi State over the weekend. The Bulldogs are making a late push to try and flip him. Of course, wasn't the most encouraging performance from Mississippi State. Kind of lost control there against Georgia, and wasn't particularly close. So that's a recruitment I'm keeping an eye on late in terms of commits to watch. No real concern about Danny Odom, four-star cornerback commit at this point. The expectation is he's going to sign with Nebraska in December. No real concern at this point, unless Ohio State makes a really, really strong late push. But at this point, they've moved on to other cornerback targets. Michigan's moved on to other cornerback targets, and Nebraska feels pretty secure in their ability to sign Danny Odom come December 3rd. But yeah, like if there's anything left from the offense, it's potentially a fifth, or if Nola does flip, a potential fourth offensive line commit if the right one becomes available. I think they're looking for versatility, looking for a guy that could contribute pretty early, like the rest of the room that are kind of high floor type prospects that are positioned to contribute early in their careers at Nebraska, or at least factor into the rotation or compete for playing time pretty early in their careers. Defensively, that's where the needs really lie. Nebraska still doesn't have a defensive line commit. They're staying pretty proactive and trying to address those needs, assessing everything. They're looking at guys that are committed elsewhere that aren't really talking to the school they're committed to. Programs that could potentially move on from their coaches, or programs that could see their head coaches poached away. They're staying really proactive in assessing new defensive line targets. Most recently, they offered Tico Crittenden Jr., who recently decommitted from Florida State. He's from Georgia. He's assessing some options closer to home. We'll see just how serious of or how real of a shot Nebraska gets at him as the newest contender. Feels like he's a guy that's going to explore some options closer to home. But Nebraska, with the familiarity, with the kind of scheme familiarity with what Florida State does, of course, Tony White over there, Nebraska running something similar with that familiarity, and the fact that he would be a scheme fit. Just curious to see how serious Nebraska takes that recruitment in these coming weeks. They're keeping their eyes open on like I said, there's a lot that could change here in these next 3-4 weeks. I know, time, we're less than a month out from signing day, but just with the coaching carousel already in motion, with what some of these hires could look like before signing day, there's a chance for a lot of movement, and Nebraska is staying proactive, so that you could see some new names emerge on the defensive line board. Nebraska really quickly working to get guys on campus, or potentially even landing guys almost sight unseen. Just with what the kind of movement that's expected here late in this cycle on the coaching side of things, could really make things really interesting late in the cycle, and even after signing day. Guys can get out of their letter of intent, especially if their coaches move on. Like that's something we've seen before. We'll continue to see, and especially if Nebraska doesn't see any movement on along their coaching staff, they would be well positioned to kind of poach and take advantage of some movement elsewhere. That's really how I see Nebraska addressing the D line through the high school ranks at this point. It's going to have to be late. There's really no opportunity for strong late evals at this point. Those guys are all taken, and there really isn't. You're not doing like Nebraska wants instant impact guys. You're not really Those guys aren't really available right now. You're gonna have to flip somebody. So more so than ever, I think if Nebraska's going to land a high school defensive line commit, it's going to come from it's going to be a flip. It's going to be a late flip, or it's going to be an established guy like a Demond Moose, who they had officially visit a couple of weeks ago. He was at Florida State 2 weekends ago, so it's down to those two plus NC State, and he's planning to make a decision after his high school season ends. Right now, I think it's a head-to-head battle between Florida State and Nebraska. NC State's still lurking in that one. I think coaching that job potentially stabilizing is making them a contender, reestablishing themselves as a contender in that recruitment. So again, just it seems pretty uncertain right now how Nebraska is going to address D line at this point. I would look to the portal at this point. I think Nebraska, if they're going to for in terms of instant impact guys, it's going to have to come through the portal. They may land a late guy late. They may land one, but it's going to be like maybe one, maybe two, maybe and you have to factor in the fact that they are technically getting two freshmen back in Tyson Terry and Malcolm Simpson, who enrolled this year but missed the whole season with injury. One tore his ACL, the other dealing with a shoulder injury. Both are expected back in 26, and Nebraska thought they'd have those guys as contributors this season. And they are pretty young in the D line. They are counting on some development through that room from this year going into next year. That's all kind of factored in, or kind of part of the calculus with the staff, but they recognize that they need to get bigger. They recognize they need um, more depth and more kind of more better contributions from that unit. So I mean, that's where I'm looking at this point. I'm looking at the portal there. Linebacker, similar thing. Nebraska swung a few times to try and add another linebacker to join Jace Reynolds in the class. They went after Marcus Jennings out of Detroit, but then he recently picked up an offer from in-state Michigan, and I expect things to move quickly there. And he could be flipped by the time this video comes out. But he's a guy that I think that's Michigan's recruitment to lose at this point. They went after Aiden Reeder. He already flipped to Michigan from Wisconsin. So they've tried. We'll see if they take any more swings here late in this cycle at the linebacker position. That's not necessarily as big of a need as other positions for them. That's another one where I would look. They want to get faster they want to get more athletic, I'd look to the portal there again. I think that's where I'd look for Nebraska to address those needs. And then in the secondary, Nebraska's still looking for the big playmaking safety. They were after Tedarius Hughes, felt good about their chances at Tedarius Hughes, but he was at Syracuse last weekend, and then he flipped to Syracuse coming out of the weekend, and so now he's happily committed to the Orange. Not expecting him to potentially move any further from there. So what's really left for Nebraska? They're still after Jacob Eberhard, four-star athlete out of Kirkwood, Missouri. He's, Oklahoma's still in that mix too. They're trying to flip, but he's happily committed to Illinois. But programs have continued to lurk: Missouri, Oklahoma, Nebraska. Nebraska try to get him on campus at points. Have not been able to do that just yet. They'll try before signing day to still get that, especially now that Hughes is flipped elsewhere. Eberhard kind of by default becomes the top safety target on the board. I mean, besides him, again, it's one of those things where they may just look at their what they have, what's available, and turn to the portal. They may take some swings at guys like JJ Dunnigan, who was committed to Kansas for a long time and is assessing some other options now. He's back on the market, and they may circle back on guys in South Florida that they liked. There's a few guys down there that they moved on from because of how they felt about other recruitments, or kind of just lost out on. They could circle back on. So there's a couple moving pieces there. In terms of familiar names to keep an eye on, Devin Jackson, who's committed to Oregon, teammates with Danny Odom. Nebraska still has a really good relationship there. Will they make an effort? I don't know. I think Oregon, kind of negotiated themselves into a different strategy. Put that recruitment out of a lot of programs reach, and at this point I think he's just headed to Oregon. He's headed to Eugene. So we'll see what happens there. Right now the name to watch would be Jacob Eberhardt in my opinion. Again, there could be a name or two that emerges here in the next few weeks. I'll have updates over at InsideNebraska.com as those names become available. Honestly, the name I would monitor, just um not in the sense that I see him as an instant impact defensive back or anything, but of course keep in mind when Nebraska landed the commitment of Danny Odom, and as they've monitored that recruitment, they are also after his teammate Juju, or former teammate Juju Johnson out of Farrell, Pennsylvania. Athlete with technically a PWO from the Huskers. Plays running back at Farrell, but also plays defensive back. More of an would be an athlete take at Nebraska, and he's one that again that I'm just looking at him as a addition to the class before December 3rd, expecting that to happen for Nebraska. He's one this staff has felt really good about watching his senior tape as an athlete take. So just one file away as a as they look to address this DB need. They may pivot through the portal and essentially just take Johnson as the second high school DB commit in this class as a quote unquote athlete. I know that's a little confusing, but I hope that kind of makes sense. But again, at this point, waiting to see what happens. I know that's not easy. It's weird, but 3.5 weeks to have so much uncertainty around the board, around what's left. But that's just kind of the state of things. Just an example of how quickly some of this stuff could move. Nebraska after Penn State fired James Franklin, Nebraska made an offer out to Penn State defensive line commit Tavian Branch and have tried to get Branch on campus. It hasn't happened just yet. He made a visit to Ole Miss. That's kind of the one visit he has planned. He's also planning to visit Auburn. And Ole Miss is essentially seen as the favorite at this point. But what happens if Lane Kiffin leaves for LSU or Florida late and he comes back available? Does he assess what happens at Penn State? Does Nebraska find themselves back in it late? Does he, there's so much more that could still happen with guys that are, have decommitted and are in quote unquote their second recruitments. Uh, all of these processes become accelerated when the timeline is so short. So you're going to see a lot happen in a really fast pace over these next 3 weeks or so. And Nebraska is going to hit the road this week during the bye week. You're going to see some potential new names emerge on the defensive side of the ball, at potentially defensive line, at safety. I'm very curious to see where Terry Braden pops up this weekend. I'm very curious where Matt Rule, defensive coordinator John Butler pop up this weekend, where Addison Williams is at this weekend, where Dikeel Shorts heads this weekend. Nebraska has needs to address, and I don't get the sense that they're sitting idly waiting, waiting for the portal to come. They're assessing their options. They know the portal's out there for them. They know, more of these instant impact type guys are available in the portal rather than the high school cycle at this point, but they're staying proactive. They understand how much movement is potentially going to happen here in these next few weeks, how much movement's already happened. And so they're maintaining communication with top recruits across the country. So keep an eye on where these coaches end up. We'll have updates over at InsideNebraska.com as soon as we know once some of these plans are set. So like I said, stay tuned over there. We appreciate you guys tuning in to I know this is kind of an all over the place episode, but appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll be back with another episode next week with a special guest.